So thank you again for joining us for the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum's virtual lecture series talking about Race Matters. Join the conversation. My name is Caroline McCarthy, and I am the Director of Community Engagement at the Farmhouse. Talking about Race Matters is a series that explores the topic of race throughout history, centering a different theme each season. Our goal throughout has been to encourage people to come together and engage in a conversation on a topic that can sometimes be uncomfortable. This season of Talking About Race Matters is a 3-week series centered around health and wellness. Our presenters will explore these topics, beginning with the period of enslavement in the United States and connecting the themes to present day. During the lecture, if you have any questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function and we will get to those questions at the end. We would like to thank all of you for attending today, and we would also like to sincerely thank this year's Talking About Race Matters sponsor, TD Bank. Please welcome Marcus Gonzalez, who will share a few words on behalf of TD.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Caroline. Thank you for joining us for today's session, where we will discuss the historical deconstruction of Black womanhood. Being raised by two strong Black women, my mother and my sister, I understand the importance Black women have in our history and in our future. Again, as Caroline said, Marcus Gonzalez, Community Business Development Officer and co-lead of our Black Employee Network here at TD Bank, where our purpose is to enrich the lives of our customers, colleagues, and communities. That's why we're so committed to improving access to key resources that help us build stronger relationships in business as well as within ourselves. I'm blessed to once again today have the privilege to be educated by Dr. Maria DeLongoria. Along with her long list of accolades and accomplishments, Dr. Maria has been a longtime friend of the bank, from sharing historical background on Juneteenth for multiple years to leading our discussion around dismantling systemic racism, where she helped us bring together community leaders in the wake of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. I'm excited to learn more from Dr. Maria today. Hope you all enjoy today's session, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Marcus, and thank you again, TD Bank. I'm also excited to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Maria DeLongoria. Dr. DeLongoria is the Interim Associate Provost for Academic and Faculty Affairs at Queens College of the City University of New York. Today, she is presenting Degendered and Dehumanized, the Historical Deconstruction of Black Womanhood. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Maria DeLongoria.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you, Christina and to Marcus. I'm really appreciative of the invitation to be here today. I think this is a timely presentation given the current political climate that we are in and have been witnessing, right? Because what we're seeing is the gendered and racial attacks on women. And particularly in the political arena, right? And so this presentation is going to provide a historical foundation for the origin of some of these concepts. I titled this Degendered and Dehumanized, right? The historical deconstruction of Black womanhood, because that has been the purpose, right? That the creation of a narrative that allows for a certain treatment, a disregard, a declassification of Black women as women. There's a relatively new term that was, and I say relatively new, it was 2008. So while it wasn't yesterday, it's not a term that's been around for generations. This term is called misogynoir. And misogynoir is defined as the strategic attack or assault on Black women, right? It's the misogynistic, it's misogyny as well as the racism that intersects in Black women's beings. So just as the social and legal status of Black women historically have been defined by both race and gender, so have the preconceptions commonly held about their nature and their character. Modern imagery developed through the intersection of both racism and sexism, which merged to influence how many viewed Black womanhood. These perceptions, while embedded in slavery, began in the 15th and 16th century with European contact with Africa and the slave trade industry, shaping representations in the colonial and antebellum periods. Not only surviving the post-emancipation era, these images intensified during Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction as a way to reinforce racial and gender supremacy. Reinvented further to subjugate Blacks at the turn of the century, misrepresentations found life in historical documents and literature, as well as popular culture, creating images that have yet to disappear. African pre-slavery often described as one of cannibalism and savagery. This grossly inaccurate assessment derived from observations of African culture, religion, religious beliefs, and lifestyles that were very different from those of Europeans. These differences, described as deviant, led to distortions that negatively stereotyped Africans and their descendants. Many of the stereotypes applied to Africans regardless of gender, while others specifically addressed Black women. Africans frequently described as brutish, bestial, and beastly were often associated with animals, particularly apes. Consequently, assertions were made regarding the supposed bestiality of the bestial nature of Africans. Moreover, some commentators compared the alleged lewd and lascivious nature of both Africans and animals. The idea of lasciviousness was exploited through keen distortions of African marital practices such as polygamy and styles of dress. Europeans associated the presence of multiple wives with an insatiable sexual appetite in the male. Style of dress, especially among African females, further supported these assumptions. Much was written about nakedness, and English slave traders mistook semi-nudity, especially the exposure of Black women's breasts, as vulgarity. Their breasts were described as long and full, their bodies believed made for easy childbearing. Moreover, according to the English, their temper was hot, quote, that's a quote, and they made no issue of prostituting themselves. Conversely, descriptions of this nature were never given to white women. African traditions such as dancing and religious practices were also misinterpreted. Dancing was characterized as lustful, orgy-like in nature, and described as violent exercise, but so irregular and grotesque. Religion, or the presumed lack of, was deemed as one of the reasons Africans were savage. The absence of Christian icons and ceremonial tradition led Europeans to perceive Africans as devil worshippers, as opposed to recognizing different religious and spiritual rituals. These images of Africans, Negroes as they were commonly called, developed and spread rapidly. As slavery expanded and became an integral part of American society, so did the created imagery of Blacks. Supporters of slavery further advanced the idea of the savage Negro who needed white paternalism to contain the beast within. They were simply inferior, quote, by reason of color, end quote. Their Africanness disfigured them with, quote, horrid curls, lips, and nose, end quote. Historian George Ferguson characterized the abundant stereotypes of Blacks into two groups, hard stereotypes and soft stereotypes. Every Black person fell into one of those categories. Hard stereotypes were scary, threatening images designed to reinforce the ideas that the peculiar institution domesticated or tamed the savage Negro brute, that without white dominance, their savage nature was a threat to civilized society. Soft stereotypes created opposite images, although for the same purpose of justifying enslavement. The emergence of a non-threatening content slave forced the idea that slavery was good to and for Blacks. It put society's fears of savagery at bay with the image of a happy, loyal slave. Hard images were those that created fear in the society. They were images of uncivilized devil worshippers who would corrupt the nation. Black women were irrational in thought and deed. They were dirty and disease-infested. They held within them uncontrollable sexual passion that was dangerous to the social hierarchy as well as to the health of whites. The oversexed nature of Blacks was supported in white psyche by the alleged ease that both men and women exhibited in remarrying once a partner was sold. The female personification of this hard image was most easily seen in the creation of the Jezebel character, the lewd, promiscuous, unclean Black female. Soft images of Black character traits presented a different image, an image that was both mentally and physically inferior. This was not to imply that the image of the hard Black was not inferior, but soft characterizations presented a slower thinking, slower moving creature. Think of there were cartoons out in the 20s and 30s, and even some of the old movies, you always saw a slow talking and thinking Black man, and or Black woman, and this is how they performed. So that's an example of the softer, slower image, right? This person needed the master to guide him or her. They were loyal and affectionate, almost childlike in their admiration for their owners. They were happy with their situation and could not imagine any other way of life. Religion helped bring them to the point of being docile and accepting their position in life as subordinates. The beloved image of Mammy was the female embodiment of this image. Although some of the same objectives were applied to both Black and men and women, the impact that resulted from such racial profiling was different. Since race was the determining factor with these stereotypes, it, meaning race, is in essence allowed for the defeminization of Black women. By defeminizing them, Black women were pigeonholed because they were not white and not women. It also prevented them from ever being, quote, women or ladies. They were in essence deraced, degendered, and dehumanized. Womanhood, or being a lady, was critical to gender identity and played an even more pivotal role in social structure. Being identified as such offered white women special protections, especially in the South. These protections were non-existent for Black women. This comes along with this idea of this Southern lady and the cult of true womanhood. The Southern lady was an image that emerged out of the concept of the cult of true womanhood. The cult of true womanhood was a phrase used frequently to convey the universal understood responsibilities of women. And when I just say women, they're referring to white women. This model of womanhood, white womanhood, was grounded in Victorian values that permeated American society during the antebellum period. Not only did it regulate white women's behavior in the sphere of domesticity, the proper sphere for women, but it scripted behavior for men, children, and communities. While construction of this idea applied to all white women, it found its home in the heart of the South, where it's embedded in Southern culture. White Southerners used the standards of true womanhood to foster feelings of superiority for their women versus white women of the North, as well as to further highlight the generally accepted assumption of inferiority applied to Black women. As a result, the myth of the Southern lady or Southern belle emerged and flourished not only in the 19th century, but well into the 20th, and some argue even today. Directives as to ladylike or belle's behavior was part of everyday life. Instructions came within the home, church, and community. Reinforcements of expected ideals were presented in speeches, sermons, memoirs, poems, newspapers, women's magazines, and religious literature. For the wealthy, boarding schools aided in determining what constituted correct female behavior by focusing more on the feminine arts of domesticity than academics. Learn skills such as spinning, weaving, sewing, gardening, and overseeing house slaves. For those not exposed to boarding school education, whether by choice or economic inability, training came primarily from, quote, the excellent, kind mother. 4 basic elements governed true womanhood. Every aspect of women's lives fell under the guidelines and interconnectedness of piety, purity, domesticity, and submission. Women were expected to be spiritual, remain pure, be devoted, and maintain a good home, while at the same time appear weak and submissive in need of protection. True women were Christian, and through their faith, women were to become, quote, a better Eve. Following religious directives kept women in their homes. Fostering the development of a more domestic and submissive wife was the ultimate goal. Scriptures and interpretation thereof were used as suppressants of outside thoughts and desires, especially as related to sexuality. It was expected that, quote, all good women and respectable wives were to suppress such needs. So as I'm describing what this cult of true womanhood, you can see that it was also a cage, right? It was also a restraining or some sort of limited bondage for white women as well. Every good lady and belle managed the affairs of the home. Domesticity was not only a requirement, but a certain level of expertise was necessary. The home was expected to be neat, clean, and orderly. It was to be cheerful, where hospitality abounded. Women were the comforters and nurturers, often functioning as nurses. And in those roles, they were expected to be gentle and patient and compassionate. Purity and chastity were extremely important elements of this Southern womanhood. The absence of both was considered unnatural and unfeminine. The Southern lady was to be modest in her dress to avoid unwanted attention. Women were expected to maintain their innocence, even though men were expected to challenge it. I mean, that's a whole contradiction we can talk about in the Q&A. This often left young women, quote, disadvantaged in terms of experience in comparison to their husbands. Single women were to be chaste until marriage, and again, respectable wives were to suppress their sexuality and desires. Mary Chestnut, a Southern planter's wife in the mid-1800s, was admonished for walking in public with men, even though she was married and she was at a later age, so it wasn't as if she was young, and that was simply for walking in public. Marriage and family were critical variables of true womanhood. Husbands and children were how true women defined themselves. Single women were supposed to marry for love, not money, although that expectation did not apply to man. A man could marry, marriage to an, quote, old, ugly, red-headed cleaver heiress to a handsome, worthless young man was not only not unusual, but often accepted. The married woman's focus was on her husband, catering to his physical needs. She was to live in silence, deferring to him in all manners. Women tried extremely hard to live up to these ideals and never knowingly do anything that he would not approve of. Motherhood was also an added I'm getting so tongue-tied, I'm sorry. Motherhood was expected as an added dimension to her usefulness and her prestige. Women who did not produce offspring questioned their viability and status of women. Chestnut referred to herself as a childless wretch when reflecting on the implications from her father-in-law that women without children were useless. And that kind of sounds familiar, right? Some of these things are ringing true because I think there were some comments made by somebody running for office about childless women recently. Victorian principles of family positions and responsibilities placed men in the roles of physical protectors. Married belles or women were thereby dependent on their husbands, while single belles were dependent on male family members. Moreover, both required protection from the outside world, especially from the threat of attack by Black men. In sense, womanhood was closely related to manhood and Southern honor. These ideals of true womanhood vary slightly with class status. Women who were not a part of the slaveholding elite were still expected to live by the code of the Southern lady. Any variation in practice appeared in the realm of the home where domestic duties of planter class women differed from their lesser wealthy counterparts. Planter class women obtained various degrees of education, including music and language instruction. And, I've referenced the boarding schools earlier. They were also responsible for the taxing job of managing house slaves. Yeomen and non-slaveholding women of the classes had little use for such formal education. Their domestic duties included washing, ironing, cooking, and other domestic tasks that are usually performed by slaves in elite households. They were expected to help in the fields if necessary, support their husbands in economic endeavors, and bring in additional income when possible. All other elements of true womanhood, purity, piety, submissiveness, were applicable, and women who did not abide by these standards were considered fallen or lower class. The elements of true womanhood as applied to white women aided in preserving the image of pure, untouchable women of a Southern lady, while at the same time reinforced the negative images of Black women by attaching unwomanly and unladylike characteristics to them. Black women were not called even ladies by white society under any circumstances. To do so was an insult to white women and what they represented. Nor were they described by other terms used to depict white women, such as church women or God-fearing or reform or club women. Most terms applicable to Black women were derogatory in nature. These terms, these women, were described as fiends, brutes, and negresses. On a rare occasion where what was considered a lower class term woman was used, it was prefaced with Negro and used interchangeably with fiend and brute and murderess. This disfiguring of Black women's images shaped historical memory, allowing for only one positive image of Black womanhood, the sole emblem of good Black womanhood, the mammy. As discussed earlier, the image of mammy was a soft stereotype used to describe Black women, African-American women, or women of African descent in America in particular. The image of the old, genderless, docile mammy emerged during the 1820s in Southern literature, although references to similar aunties and ancients predated 1820. The image of the most beloved servant was embedded in the American psyche and was intended to displace sexuality into nurture and to transform potentially hostility into love. In theory, mammy ran the household. She was supervisor, cook, housekeeper, nurse, and seamstress. She was two-dimensional in that one image of her related disposition and the other to her physical attributes. Mammy's personality was that of a trusted slave. Her loyalty was childlike and absolute. She was an expert in her domestic duties, being extremely clean and often supervising other house slaves. Faithful and reliable, Mammy was available whenever she was needed, day or night. She was firm yet kind when dealing with white children left to her care. She was devoted to and protective of these children, often putting their needs above the needs of her own children. Mammy was a strange combination of religion, superstition, and humor. She followed the master's religion best she could, yet elements of African spiritualities and beliefs remained with her. Although never acknowledged, Mammy was the perfect mixture of the ideal slave and the ideal woman. She performed the domestic duties of a true woman, while exhibiting the docile, contented disposition of the happy slave. What more could slave owners desire? Physically, Mammy was described as big, strong, and able-bodied. She had to be able to take care of everybody. She was dark in complexion with large, overstated features. She was extremely overweight with a generous bosom, rendering her unattractive by societal standards, ungendered her. It was, in fact, her sexlessness that made her ugly and unwanted, but also acceptable in Southern households. This sexlessness endeared her to society. Her image, dressed in drab long dresses and aprons, reinforced the farce of propriety. A bandana covered her uncontrollable hair, further enhancing the picture of an undesirable woman. This desexualized image was fundamental to the defense of slavery as an institution that promoted racial affection. Merging the physical and dispositional images of Mammy produced an asexual, non-aggressive servant who was neither a threat to the mistress nor a temptation for the master. She was the best of the best, often described as a, quote, a member of the family in high standing. Though she governed heralded her devotion to her white family while at the same time emphasized the understanding of her physical self. Her status in slaveholders' views was advanced above others, especially because of her proximity to true white women elevated her. Her existence proved slavery to be a benevolent institution that fostered love and admiration to and for those enslaved. The same mentality continued after the end of slavery. Post-emancipation images of Mammy were found in the loyal living nanny, the effective washerwoman, and later of that of Aunt Jemima. However, an alter ego also existed. The opposite image of Mammy, the hard, stereotypical characterization of the Black woman, was Jezebel. These two images coexisted in the minds of America, and particularly the South, each needing each other to survive. The image of Jezebel was created out of necessity to justify or explain certain behaviors. In society that created true womanhood, there had to be a balance of power, so to speak. There had to be an image or a subscriptive behavior for those who were not entitled to pedestal status. Mammy could not embrace this image because of her placement within the white household. Theoretically, Jezebel was everything that the true woman was not. She was everything that Mammy was not. She was not loving. She was not loyal. She was not trustworthy. She was neither religious nor maternal. She was not ugly. She was fiendish, brutish, and at times beastly. She was a threat to Southern mores and tranquility within the household. So as previously discussed, derogatory images, of Black women began with the slave trade, right? And warped interpretations of African customs and traditions. And these negative impressions gained credibility within the experiences of slavery. An association with the animalistic nature was made labeling the Black woman as a negress, a term closely related to tigress. Keeping with this theme, Black women were supposedly as accessible as animals in heat and always seeking sexual gratification. Especially passionate and driven by desire, Jezebel was responsible for white men's lapse in propriety. Being from an inferior servile class so far removed her from the presence of true women, Jezebel could never elate her status even to Mammy. Jezebel, like Mammy, had physical descriptions. She was described as having brown skin rather than the overemphasized dark complexion of Mammy. The lighter Jezebel's skin, the more attractive she became. She was voluptuous versus fat. She had a large behind that was described as high. Her lips were full, but described as they were part of a sensual mouth versus Mammy's just full, big lips. Her clothes revealed more skin than Mammy's long dresses, thereby reinforcing her sexuality. She was a, quote, good-looking woman, but not beautiful. Beautiful was an adjective that was just reserved for ladies. Jezebel, however, was a whore with an evil disposition. She drank, was impure, and prone to sexually deviant behavior. She was considered more accessible and experienced than white women. Jezebel was more responsive to the advances of white men, having a special attraction for them. Her unrestrained desires caused her to become overly sexually active and therefore responsible for the natural increase in the slave population. Early onset sexual activity was also a contributing factor. Defenders of this argument stated that they, quote, there were, quote, actually no chaste Negro girls after the age of 15 or 16. Additionally, many, if not most, Southern boys began their sexual experiences with Negro girls at approximately the same age. Behavior such as this was entirely acceptable since parents expected sons to be prepared for marriage, although, as previously stated, white women were expected to be chaste. Jezebel was not simply promiscuous, but sexually aggressive. Because of this aggressive nature, she was held responsible for events in which she was the victim. As author Martha Hoad states, the dominant visions of the antebellum South, Black women seduced white men. The responsibility of the rape of Black women, both during and after slavery, was placed on Jezebel. It was argued that if Black women were sexually uncontrollable, as stated, if they were driven by the need for sexual gratification, who could blame white men, slavery, or the confining rhetoric of true womanhood for the sexual abuse administered at the hands of white men? Her lurid behavior excused white men who transgressed the color line. It shifted the responsibility for inappropriate behavior from him to Jezebel, even though white men, quote, customarily took Negro women to bed, end quote. Jezebel was responsible for not only the misconduct of white men, but white men held her accountable for misconduct of Black men. It was argued that Black men's jealousy was aroused by the conduct of his women. Black men were so accustomed to the wantonness of women of his race that he was unable to understand the severity of any attack on virtuous white womanhood. Because Black women were of such bad character and lacked virtue, Black men and boys were inclined to criminal behavior, including raping white women. See this, so as I continue to talk about this, and as you reflect on what I just said, I opened with that term misogynoir, right? And that was the unique place that Black women held by being both Black and female, by having to experience both racism and sexism, and then having this behavior attributed to them, having this responsibility placed on them is a perfect example. Okay, Jezebel was responsible for white men and white women being exposed to venereal diseases. It was her uncleanliness, sexual deviance, and powers of seduction that endangered the white family health. White men, in turn, passed infection to white women. Jezebel was hot-tempered and hot-constituted, which led her to prostitute herself. Noted for her fertility, in addition to her sexual appetite, one of Jezebel's tasks was that of a breeder. Children that were created out of breeding were sold for profit or kept for increasing the master slave population, aka net worth. It seemed only natural that one so sexually motivated was used as an automatic incubator and producer of human livestock. Ex-slave women reported having as many as 30 children, and some had as many as 5 before they were 20 years old. Incapable of knowing or understanding love, Jezebel had a preconceived disassociation and detachment from her children, which made separation easy, especially in the case of sale. This argument for lack of emotion and indifference was also witnessed in Jezebel's ability to move freely from one mate or husband to another. Two other images of Black women that existed were that of the conjure woman and the tragic mulatto. Both were subsets of sorts of Jezebel, offering varying variations of her image, but neither as popular. The conjure woman was a Black African, and I say that in quotes, often described as dark and evil. She was wild, mean, and intimidating. Classified as a heathen, she incorporated elements of African religion, spirituality, and superstition into her activities. She was thought as potentially danger. She was thought of as a potential danger, and quote, they was all scared of her, end quote. The idea of the tragic mulatto was most popular in post-slavery periods, although her presence was noted prior to slavery's end. She was, quote, yellow in color, but was always mad and angry and sullen. She was seductive, but her appeal often regulated her to the status of a sex object. White women hated and feared her because of her closeness to visual whiteness. Her children were often sold out of fear of what and who they really represented. As Chestnut, who I referenced earlier, the plantation mistress, so eloquently stated, every lady tells us who is father of all the mulatto children in everybody else's household, but that of her own. Jezebel was presumed, excuse me, Jezebel held a presumed, quote, pride at bearing offspring that had an admixture of blood of the ruling class. After emancipation, with the loss of immediate unrestricted access to Black women, miscegenation was used as proof of freedmen's depravity and sexual savagery. So miscegenation was this race mixing. And after slavery, where the unrestricted access, where there was a lot of freed women were removed from the direct household, right? They were saying that the evidence of these mixed race children was proof that the promiscuity of Black women continued. White women, although attracted to her, feared her in freedom. Removed from the control of the ruling house, the threat of mistakenly marrying a Black woman / mulatto with white skin was ever present. Many of the same 18th and 19th stereotypes of Black women continued to thrive in post-emancipation America, especially in the South. In fact, a more intense, wild, unsupervised image of Jezebel emerged as the example of what happens to Black women without the paternalism of slavery. Jezebel was becoming the bad, uncontrollable, angry Black woman, sometimes called Sapphire. This crazier version of her intensified fears that Black moral deficiencies threaten white civilizations. These fears were compounded by inaccurate reports that now 90% of Negro women were not virtuous. The emergence of Aunt Jemima as the 20th century mammy carried her stereotypical representation into the present. Aunt Jemima, first introduced into America through minstrel shows in the late 1800s, gained popularity in 1891 when Chris Root, owner of a flour mill, used her as the icon for his pancake syrup. What was particularly interesting was that Aunt Jemima in the minstrel shows was a white man in blackface and drag. I'll let that sit for a second. When in 1893, Root hired someone to appear as Aunt Jemima at an expo highlighting his pancake mix, he selected a woman who mirrored the stereotypical image. Hugely successful in marketing his product, Aunt Jemima became a symbol of acceptable Black womanhood. She had a dark complexion and was obese, keeping with the historical image of Mammy. Her lips were big and red, her teeth overly white, and her head wrapped in a bandana. She displayed the traditional grin of the eager-to-please slave. Aunt Jemima was not as headstrong as Mammy. She was more polite and respectable to white people. Usually confined to the kitchen, she enjoyed cooking and serving. Over time, some of the visual aspects of her image have changed as related to the pancake icon. No longer wearing a bandana, her modernized image still stereotypes Black women. Recent representations of Aunt Jemima were found in movies, such as the Big Mama characters, popularized by television shows such as That's My Mama, which was from the 70s, What's Happening, which was the late 70s, Martin Lawrence's Big Mama's House in the 2000s. Big Mama was everything that Mammy and Aunt Jemima were, only a more domineering figure. She was what many called the Black matriarch, the strong, obese, and emasculating. Both images of Mammy and Jezebel have survived in historical and collective memory. Oral traditions, visual memory, and memorabilia contributed to the retentions of these images that painted one-dimensional views of each character. For Mammy, both the physical and theoretical images still exist. The images have been reinforced through accounts from grown children who were former charges and from memorabilia that has immortalized stereotypical representations. Grown children often remembered their mammies or nannies affectionately as big old women. Children often perceived anyone older than themselves, anyone out of their immediate age range as old. And this was the case in Mammy. In reality, Mammy's ages often ranged. They could be as young as 15 or 20 and as old as their bodies would allow. To a 5-year-old, 40, 30, and even 20 was old. Remembering Mammy as an older woman worked towards the goal of desexualizing her, just as remembering her as fat and unattractive did. She could not be an attractive woman, a sexual being, a young woman, and have that close proximity to a white family. This is seen even through the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and through modern day. Visual memory and memorabilia also enforced Mammy as old, obese, and ugly. Dolls and figurines made representations of Mammy portrayed her as fat, extremely Black in color, and possessing unrealistically exaggerated figures. These negative images can be found in dolls from almost any period in United States history. One particularly offensive doll was the Gollywog, which portrayed Black women as having overly large noses, lips, and eyes, and full-bodied breasts and bottoms. They were often smiling, exposing unnaturally white teeth. The dolls were extremely unsightly and believed to be true representations of the unattractiveness of Black women. In fact, many Black dolls made by whites were so characteristically offensive that Black parents made their own dolls for their children. Collective memory and oral tradition were other methods of preserving the images that represented Black women. Interviews included in the Federal Writers Project of the Work Progress Administration, also called WPA, describe many of the elderly Black women as aunt or auntie. For instance, interviews with WPA of Molly Almond in 1937. Almond was referred to as Aunt Molly Almond before anyone even met her. They further described her as gentle as a child. Nanny Bradford was described as a little fat old woman with a broad smile which displays bright white teeth. Aunt Hattie Clayton had a coal Black face. Amy Chapman was referred as Aunt Amy, even though she introduced herself by name. And nowhere in the interview did she refer to herself as Mammy, Aunt, or Auntie. This pattern continued with descriptions of being very clean in appearance, being neat and prim, being strong. Perhaps one of the most conventional descriptions was that of Tildy Collins, or Aunt Tildy, as she was recorded in the WPA interviews. She was a, quote, typically Black mammy, orthodox type, greatly beloved. That's what went into the interview that was what was recorded by the interviewer. Oral tradition also preserved the images of Jezebel, although through different techniques. White folklore was instrumental in retaining her image and revealed how deeply rooted white stereotypes of Black female sexuality are. Stories and jokes about Black female sexuality retold as if they were true accounts. Many of these had origins dating back to the auction block, where the so-called negresses were put up and scandalous, indecent questions and jests were permitted. Usually crude in nature, they picked up popular themes such as the sexual relationships between Blacks as envisioned by whites. Radis and Mandy were a type of joke that often contained sexual derogatory humor, focusing on Black women's vitality and promiscuity. And an example of this type of joke is this following joke that I'll share with you. A doctor going through the colored ward in a hospital sees 4 Negro women nursing babies. He asked the first one when her baby was born, and she says June 1st. He asked the second one when her baby was born, and she says June 1st. He asked the third one, and she says June 1st. He goes to the next bed with a knowing smile and says, well, I suppose your baby was born June 1st too. No, sir, boss, the woman answers. It sure wasn't. I ain't go to that same picnic. So these were the kinds of things that have played their way and have remained through history, that have been passed down and have sustained through history. These images of Mammy and Jezebel were constructed for reasons, some of which were already discussed. Mammy was stationed within the house with a close proximity to the master and the mistress during slavery. Because of this closeness, the South needed a safe, enduring representation of Black women to show the benevolence of the institution. And I am being mindful of the time. Creating a lovable character to ease tensions. Creating an asexual character dissipated any presumption of impropriety. What respectable white man would abuse an old, fat, ugly caregiver, one that was so beloved by all? After slavery, Mammy was still situated in the white family, close to the husband and wife as the children, and so this needed to continue. White fear of Black misconduct was on the rise after emancipation with the loss of control over former slaves. The white South wanted to feel secure. They wanted to return to the old social order, and the presence of Mammy helped put them a step closer to that. The mythical images of Mammy and Jezebel determined how Southerners defined and defended their behaviors and treatment of Black women. These images were crucial to understand the dynamics that operated in this country's history. However, it is also important to determine what these images sought to conceal rather than reveal. Mammy's image was misleading on several levels. She was hailed as a centerpiece in Southern perceptions of the perfectly ordered society. Again, the ideal slave, the ideal housekeeper, the ideal nurse, the ideal cook. Realistically, Mammy did not represent the experiences of most female slaves, servants, or domestics. Much of Southern narrative had the all-powerful Mammy running all aspects of domestic duties within the home. This placed her in what Michelle Wallace called the myth of the superwoman, at the very least the super Mammy, who challenged the fundamental principles of true womanhood, where white women were in charge of the house. Although this sphere of domesticity did allow slave-holding women to supervise house slaves and domestic duties, the mistress was presumed to be the authority. Slaves, however proficient, needed supervision and control. In the myth of Mammy, she was the expert. In reality, there were usually several slave women performing a variety of tasks in larger households, several Mammies, so to say. In smaller ones, Mammy and mistress shared duties with the mistress supervising. The physical realities of Mammy and Jezebel also differed from the mythological. Mammy's age, weight, and features were overemphasized, as I shared. Her full lips, thighs, and breasts, which are all African features, were depicted as obesity. Her old age gave her grandmotherly qualities. Her dark complexion was emphasized to distinguish her from Jezebel. Jezebel's same African features were described as voluptuous and sensual. Jezebel was believed to be younger than Mammy, having started sexual activity early, making her a whore in Southern imagination. She was brown, not black or dark. She was not only the behavioral opposite of old Black Mammy, but the physical as well. Just as Mammy's darker skin made her unattractive and desirable, safe from intimate associations with white families, Jezebel's brown skin sexualized her, directly connecting her to promiscuity. She was dangerous to the white family structure. However, her skin also made her attractive. And one of the key elements necessary for relations with Black women was that these women had to be what white men considered attractive. That meant lighter skin, although what constituted light and dark was all relative. White men were attracted to Black women who were further removed from savagery, but still possessed the Africanness that intrigued white society. In truth, both Mammy and Jezebel were desirable. They were both sexual beings who were objects of unsolicited sexual advances. They functioned in a society that needed to both quell fears and explain patterns of Black-white relationships. Both myths were created to divert focus from rape and illicit sex between master and slave, employer and employee. All Black women fell into one of the two categories, regardless of body type or complexion, regardless of their classification of faithful, beloved, asexual, or promiscuous seducing. Neither the pretty or even the commonly could ever rest easy. The images of Mammy hid the transgressions, made them deniable and unbelievable. The image of Jezebel excused the transgressions, even rationalized them. Jezebel was proof that Black women seduced poor, unsuspecting white men into inappropriate sexual encounters. These overly aggressive, deviant women were forcing sex upon, in essence, raping respectable white men. The abuse Black women received was constant, unrestricted, and most often intertwined. Elements of sexual abuse were often present in other types of physical abuse and vice versa. In some instances, these abuses have often found to hold various positions in the lynching of Black women. This was particularly true if the fear of the loss of honor existed for the white men involved. Mammy represented the non-threatening consent, although physical image, inferior image of Black women. This age-old image, I'm sorry, I just lost my place. Here we go, I'm sorry. Other images developed of Black womanhood as time progressed. Jezebel and Sapphire, along with their 20th century descendants, the welfare queen, the video vixen or the hoe, the gold digger, the fly girl, the ghetto chick, the strong, AKA angry Black women, and the badass are a bit more complicated, but are contemporary terms that have made their way into the present time. Built on hard stereotypes, they represent opposing images to Mammy, images that are scary, threatening, images that contribute to the continued characterization of Black women being overly sexualized, exaggerated, angry, and the representations of Black womanhood. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. DeLongoria. I want to remind you all to please ask questions using the Q&A function on Zoom. We already have a couple of questions for you. This first one you just started to talk a little bit about, but can you talk about how modern depictions of Black women in media compare to their historical counterparts? Are we making progress, or is there still a long way to go?
So both, we are making progress and there's still a long way to go. So the modern images, I would have gone on, but I would have gone for like another 20 minutes at least, right? So I kind of cut it short. So some of these same images that have existed are being morphed, right? And I mentioned some of the more modern ones, and you can find them in videos a lot, right? In the representations of videos, but you see them in television shows. If you look at there's a whole slew, and this can apply to both Black and white women, all those housewife shows, every single one of them, right? They plug into stereotypes of women that have their roots in these historical concepts. If you look at the Tyler Perry right? I'm not bashing him, so please, any Tyler Perry fans, do not attack me. But the reality is his characters are very stereotypical. Medea is the epitome of mammy, right? And in all of the films and the movies, there's always some poor little downtrodden, promiscuous woman who's being saved in his narratives. So having used that as an example, it's not always, it's not necessarily just white society that is permeating these images, right? It is society as a whole. It has become so embedded in our existence that there are so many people that don't even realize they're doing it. Even some of the shows that are supposed to appear more popular. There was a show, I don't remember if it was, whether it was streaming, but I forget who it was, but Gabriella Union played in this particular show, and her name was Chastity, and she was the best friend to this white character. But the idea that you have and if you watched some of the episodes, the stereotyping and naming her Chastity, right, just reinforced some of these concepts that we've talked about.
Thank you. We have a question kind of building on that. How can we as a society support and encourage more accurate and diverse representations of Black women in our history books and in media today?
Well, one of the things is we have to call it out when we see it, right? A lot of times, but Tyler Perry, for example, is popular because people are enjoying and watching it, and there's people who are not held accountable, right? And you can like it and enjoy it, but still say, hey, can we have some other representations? I think the problem comes when those are the majority of the representations or the sole representations of womanhood. Another way to do it, besides calling it out, is become part of the process, right? If we write the stories, create the narratives, when we see the images, then let's not project them, right? Let's do the work to educate. One of the things that the difficult part will be with the books, the school books, and particularly with what's going on now, right? We're trying, there's this national fight to make sure that books are not banned, right? And the books that are being banned are the ones that are projecting other images, right? And that's not what the ones that are in control want. And the ones that are in control have changed, right? They're the same, but they've changed. There are more people that don't believe this, I believe, than do, right? And I'll use the Dyckman Farmhouse, for example, right? If you believe that, you would not be doing this conversation, this series. Right. And so if we have engaged more partners like that and do more of these things and do more things in the community, right? And we also have to be examples, right? So we can't use language and behaviors that we don't want children replicating, right? And that could be our children, it could be children in the community, it could be children in the schools. There was a meme going around the internet about this woman who picked her child up from like kindergarten or first grade, and what would be, and I'm not usually very judgy, right? I like people to wear what they feel good in and what makes them feel good, but there's some things that don't go some places, right? And this particular person came in that. Now, not knowing her story, you don't know if that's all she has or what, but we have to do a little bit better as a community, as society.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of these questions are connecting to one another, so this is working out well. Our next question is, how have Black women in history used art, literature, and other forms of expression to combat stereotypes and reclaim their narratives?
How do they? It depends on what. Yeah, so they do it by writing the different stories, by putting on different performances, by giving an opposite view to what the general population or what mainstream or popular culture and popular images want to project.
Definitely. So this person is asking, if an individual realizes that they have unconsciously accepted some of these stereotypes about Black women, what can they do to undo this and develop more positive, healthy, and accurate understandings of authentic and varied Black womanhood?
So the fact that there's an acknowledgement that you bought into it is the first step and the most important step, because a lot of people don't want to recognize that they do. And look, it's not, because sometimes people embrace these things or believe these things. I don't want to say embrace and believe these things, not because they've had experience with anybody, because that's all they were told. That's all they were shown, right? So I think, as I think we have to show grace, right? And recognize that people are recognizing and trying to undo their conditioning, to undo that narrative. And so by being more exposed to people, by and it could be with people, it could be by doing reading, it could be by going to a museum, to exhibits, to watching other films than the ones that get produced, by not watching some of the things that are produced, right? And when I say that, I'm thinking of particularly some of the videos that are out there. They do a world of damage,
Yes.
right? In continuing these narratives. And people point to the creative artists that are in them, but they're not the ones in control of producing those. I hear so many stories of rappers who I know personally who want to do other things. They're not the big name ones, who want to do other things, but they're signed into this contract. They're signed into this deal. If they either do this or they don't get anything, right?
Yeah.
And so educating people, even to the point of what's a good contract for you,
Yeah.
right? So if you're going to go into this field, and to have creative control over your work and your music and how that's going to play out.
Definitely. Yes. Thank you. We always say at the museum to meet people where they are and try to give them some resources to educate themselves and do that work themselves as well. So thank you for that. So that looks like all the questions we have. So I want to thank you again for this fantastic discussion. And I would like to thank everyone who attended. I'd like to remind you that this was the second of 3 lectures in our Talking About Race Matters Join the Conversation series. Join us here on Wednesday, August 28th at 12 p.m. on Zoom for I Was Their Midwife, Pregnancy, Childbirth, and Motherhood on 17th Century Slave Ships by Dr. Andrea Mosterman. Be sure to register through the link in the chat and follow us on social media for updates. I would also ask you to please consider making a donation to the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum to enable us to continue to offer free public programming. Gifts in any amount are appreciated. Thank you again and have a great rest of your day.